Picture this. New York, early 1970s. John Lennon is not on a stadium stage. He is just a man walking into a new life. And somewhere else, in a quiet office you will never see, a file is already being written about him. Not a fan letter, not a review, a government file. Because to certain people, Lennon is not a musician anymore. He is a problem. And here is what makes this story so unsettling. Nobody has to arrest you to silence you. Nobody has to ban your songs. Sometimes all they need is paperwork. A deportation threat. A legal excuse old enough to look harmless, but sharp enough to cut you out of the country without ever admitting what they are really afraid of. So why would a famous artist be treated like a threat to the state? What did Lennon represent that made powerful people watch him, track him, and push to get him removed? And what was the moment when it became obvious the fear was not his music at all, but the influence he could build around it? Because this is not the story of Lennon, the peaceful icon. This is the story of Lennon as a danger they did not want on American soil. And once you see how they tried to move him off the stage, you will never look at celebrity, activism, or power the same way again. Let's start at the point where the myth ends and the target appears. John Lennon does not arrive in America like a criminal. He arrives like someone trying to breathe again. The Beatles are behind him. The noise of the world is still loud. And yet New York feels like a place where you can disappear inside a crowd and start over. That is the first irony. To Lennon, America is an escape. To the American state, he is an entry, a new variable, a famous man with a new address, a new network, and a microphone that reaches farther than most politicians ever will. In 1971, Lennon and Yoko Ono come to the United States on a visitor visa, expecting it to be temporary. That detail matters because the entire story that follows hinges on something that feels small and administrative, not dramatic. A visa, an extension, a signature, a stamp. Lennon is not dragged into a courtroom because he plotted something violent. He is pulled into a legal fight because the system has a way to turn everyday paperwork into a leash. When you control where someone is allowed to exist, you do not need to control what they say. You just need to decide whether they get to stay. This is where the myth starts to crack. The public image is Lennon the pacifist, Lennon the dreamer, Lennon the man who sings about imagining no countries. But in real time, in the early 70s, Lennon is also something else. He is an adult in a country on edge. Vietnam is burning in the background. Protest is not a hobby. It is a collision with authority. And the state is not just watching radicals in basements. It is watching who can energize crowds, who can normalize dissent, who can make resistance feel fashionable, even inevitable. And Lennon is not a normal activist. He is cultural gravity. He can step into a room and instantly make that room matter. He can attach himself to a cause and give it oxygen. That is why the government attention does not look like a single dramatic moment. It looks like accumulation, motion, notes, reports, an expanding paper trail. The FBI has publicly released material that touches on Lennon and his connections to anti-war and related groups in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it is easy to miss what that really implies. It implies he is being treated as part of a political landscape, not just a celebrity. The more unsettling part is how ordinary it begins. Lennon is not hiding in alleyways. He is doing interviews, appearing on television, speaking openly. That openness can feel like safety, like transparency. But in a surveillance mindset, openness becomes data. It tells you who someone is becoming, who they are standing next to, what they are willing to say on record. And in a moment where the country is tense and leadership is defensive, that kind of data is not collected for curiosity. It is collected for leverage. That is why the deportation angle is so perfect. It does not look like censorship. It looks like law and order. It looks like procedure. Lennon had a British conviction from 1968 related to cannabis resin, and immigration authorities treated it as a lever to argue he was deportable or excludable under the immigration law being applied to him at the time. This becomes the clean story you can tell the public. Not, we want him gone because he is influential, but he has a drug conviction. He does not belong here. Case closed. And that is the trick. The moral drama is public. The real motive can stay private. If you want to understand the psychological pressure of this, imagine living inside a countdown you did not start. Every plan has an asterisk. Every friendship might be described in a memo. Every public statement might be used later to color you as dangerous. Even if you do nothing wrong, the story that is being written about you can still harden. This is how someone becomes a target without ever being accused in the way you expect. They do not need to prove you are violent. They just need to suggest you are disruptive. And there is another layer that makes this period feel almost painfully human. Lennon and Ono were not only navigating politics and celebrity, they were also navigating personal chaos, including the long, brutal custody situation around Ono's daughter Kyoko, which helped shape their early 1970s life in America. So you have a couple trying to rebuild their private world, while the public world keeps pulling them into symbolism. The state sees a potential organizer. The media sees a headline. Lennon is trying to be a person, and the country around him keeps turning him into a role. By the end of this first chapter, the point is not that Lennon was secretly running some grand political operation. The point is that he did not have to. His existence was already a kind of power. And when institutions feel threatened by influence, they rarely attack it in a way that admits the truth. They use safer tools, quiet tools, legal tools, tools that make the removal look reasonable. So the real question becomes this. What was happening in America that made a musician feel like a national security headache? Why did the early 70s produce a moment where a pop culture figure could be treated as if he might tilt the political weather? Because once you see the era that Lennon walked into, you will understand why the government did not fear his music. It feared what could happen when his voice met the right crowd at the right time. To understand why John Lennon could end up treated like a political problem, you have to step into the America he walked into. This was not a calm country. It was a country with the Vietnam War on television every night, with funerals and protests, and a growing feeling that the official story was cracking. And when a society is that tense, power becomes allergic to anything that can pull large groups of people in the same direction. The early 1970s were not just about music and culture. They were about momentum, about who could move bodies into the street, who could turn anger into turnout, who could make young people feel like they were part of something bigger than their own lives. And that is where Lennon becomes different from a normal celebrity. He is not only famous, he is trusted by a generation that already suspects leaders are lying. That kind of trust is not entertainment. It is infrastructure. It is easy to forget how close politics and youth culture felt in that moment. Richard Nixon was running for re-election in 1972, and the anti-war movement was peaking. Lennon and Yoko Ono were showing up at rallies, singing and speaking, and urging people to use their vote against Nixon. Even if you agree with them or not, that is a direct collision with the idea that artists should stay in their lane. And for a White House that was obsessed with control and optics, it was the worst kind of opponent. Not a senator, not a party boss, a world-famous musician who could make dissent look cool. This is where the story shifts from myth to mechanics. Because the government does not need to beat Lennon in a debate. It does not need to disprove his message. It only needs to limit his ability to deliver it. And in America, one of the cleanest ways to reduce someone without openly punishing them is to label them a legal problem. Immigration is especially useful for that. It looks neutral. It looks procedural. It looks like the government is simply doing its job. Now, add one more ingredient, and the temperature rises. Lennon does not just speak about peace in abstract terms. He starts brushing up against activist circles in New York, the kind of circles the government already watched. And whether those circles were brilliant, chaotic, or self-destructive, the state did not care about nuance. In a surveillance mindset, association becomes suspicion. Being in the room becomes the story. There is a famous moment that captures how fast Lennon could ignite attention. In December 1971, he performed at the Free John Sinclair benefit in Michigan, a rally for a man serving a harsh sentence for a marijuana-related offense. Lennon wrote and performed a song for that cause, and the event became a symbol of celebrity mixing with radical politics. You do not need to believe the rally changed the world to understand why it mattered to authorities. It showed that Lenin could walk into a political moment and turn it into a cultural moment. And here is the key psychological point. Power does not only fear what you say today. Power fears what you might be able to organize tomorrow, especially when you can make people feel emotionally committed to a cause. A speech can be ignored. A song can be replayed. A celebrity can be followed. Lenin did not have to run for office to threaten the emotional loyalty of young voters. He only had to keep showing up at the right places. Behind the scenes, documents and reporting around this period show the government did not just passively notice Lenin. It studied him. The FBI has released material that mentions Lenin in connection with anti-war and related groups in the late 1960s and early 1970s. That phrasing sounds polite, almost boring, but it is a signal. It means Lenin was being processed as part of a political map. Then comes the part that makes the entire case feel less like coincidence and more like strategy. A memo from Senator Strom Thurmond to Attorney General John Mitchell recommended that terminating Lenin's visa would be a strategic countermeasure. Read that slowly. Strategic countermeasure. That is not the language of routine immigration enforcement. That is the language of political management. And once you understand that, the deportation story stops looking like a random legal dispute and starts looking like a lever being pulled. At this point, Lenin is trapped inside a paradox. The more visible he becomes as an activist, the easier it is to paint him as disruptive. But if he stays silent, he loses the very identity that made him Lenin after the Beatles. He is trying to be an artist with a conscience in a country that is treating conscience like a threat. Even his art in New York starts to carry that atmosphere. The one-to-one concert in 1972, framed by John and Yoko as a kind of grassroots political effort, becomes another example of how performance and activism blur together. And in a tense era, that blur makes authorities nervous because it turns entertainment into persuasion. So by early 1972, the stage is set. Lenin is in New York, famous enough to amplify any cause, connected enough to worry the people who measure influence, and outspoken enough to become useful as an example. And the government has an elegant tool ready, his immigration status, and an old drug conviction that could be presented as the official reason. And this is the cliff edge we arrive at. The public is about to see an immigration case. Lenin is about to feel it as a psychological siege. And the people who want him gone are about to do it in the cleanest way possible, not by attacking his speech, but by attacking his right to be here at all. In the next section, we follow the moment the paperwork turns into a weapon. The moment the visa stops being a form and becomes a countdown. Because once the deportation machinery starts moving, it is not just threatened to remove Lenin from America. It threatens to remove his future, one hearing at a time. The smartest way to remove someone from a country is to make it look like the country is simply enforcing rules. No headlines about censorship. No courtroom drama about free speech. Just a letter, a hearing date, and the quiet pressure of knowing your life can be paused by someone you will never meet. That is what the Lennon case becomes in 1972. Immigration authorities move from routine visa questions into formal proceedings, and the official hook is simple. A prior conviction in the United Kingdom for possession of cannabis resin. On paper, that is the story. A technical problem, a legal category, an administrative decision. But when you look at how the case is discussed behind the scenes, it starts to feel less like a random enforcement action and more like a lever being pulled. A senator sends a memo calling visa termination a strategic countermeasure, and suddenly you realize the paperwork is not neutral. It is political language wearing a legal mask. What makes this kind of pressure so effective is how it invades ordinary life. Lenin does not just fear deportation as a concept. He has to plan his days around it. Lawyers, filings, extensions, uncertainty. He cannot simply exist. He has to justify existing. And that changes a person. It changes how you speak, how you trust, how you choose friends, how you interpret a phone call, how you sleep at night. When the state cannot silence your voice directly, it can still drain your voice by forcing you to live inside a constant defense. There's also a deeper psychological trick here. Deportation proceedings do not have to end quickly to succeed. In fact, dragging them out can be the entire point. Every month you spend fighting to stay is a month you are not fully free to build momentum. Every public move you make carries risk. Every rally you attend can be framed as more evidence that you're disruptive. Even if your activism is peaceful, the narrative can be shaped to suggest you are destabilizing. The system does not need to prove you are dangerous. It only needs to keep asking the question until the public starts to wonder. This is the moment where the power dynamic becomes very clear. Lennon is not arguing about whether he loves America. He is arguing about whether he is allowed to stand on American soil while millions of people listen to him. And the government has chosen a battlefield where it holds the advantage. Immigration law is technical, is procedural, is full of terms that sound cold and final. Excludable, deportable, ineligible, discretionary. You can tell a story about a person using these words and make them sound like a problem even when the real issue is that you do not like what they represent. And then Lennon does something that changes the tone of the fight. He does not treat it like a private inconvenience. He and Yoko turn it into a public story. They make noise. They attract attention. Because if the pressure is happening in the dark, the state controls the narrative. If the pressure is happening in the light, the state has to pretend it is not personal. That public pressure matters because it forces a choice. Either the government backs off quietly, or it doubles down and risks looking like it is targeting a celebrity for political reasons. If you're listening to this and you like the feeling of pulling back the curtain on famous lives like this, the kind of stories where the public image is one thing and the hidden file is another, you are in the right place. There are many more cases like this in our channel and in our playlists on stars from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the kind of stories you do not usually hear told like an investigation. The legal fight itself becomes a maze. Courts and appeals, arguments about how to interpret a foreign conviction, and whether the law should treat it as a disqualifying offense. It sounds dry until you remember what it controls. It controls whether Lennon can stay with his family, build his life, and keep speaking in the country that has the biggest media stage on earth. In a federal appellate decision that later became central to the story, the court is basically forced to confront what happens when immigration law intersects with constitutional values and selective enforcement. Because the Lennon case is not just about a musician. It becomes a test of whether a government can use deportation as punishment without ever calling it punishment. Behind every legal argument is a simpler human reality. The people with power do not have to win the cultural argument. They only have to make the process expensive enough, exhausting enough, and uncertain enough that it slows the person down. Deportation is not just a removal tool. It is a disruption tool. It is a way of making the future feel unstable. And an unstable future is a powerful form of control. But here is the part that most people miss. The deportation battle is also a magnet. The harder the government pushes, the more it signals that Lennon matters, that there is something about him worth suppressing. And once that signal is out in the open, the case stops being only about Lennon. It starts becoming about the country, about what it tolerates, about whether influence is treated as freedom or treated as threat. By the end of this section, you can feel the trap tightening. Lennon is now living inside a system that can keep him in limbo for years. The public sees headlines and assumes it is just immigration drama. But inside government offices, there are files and memos and summaries that treat him like a variable to manage. And that is where the story turns darker. Because the legal process is only the front door. In the next section, we step into the room that always exists behind cases like this. The room where surveillance turns a person into a profile, where associations become evidence, where a concert becomes an alarm bell, and where a famous name is translated into a threat assessment. Because once you see what the file says, you start to understand what the system was truly trying to control. When most people imagine a celebrity being targeted by the government, they picture something loud, a raid, an arrest, a dramatic confrontation. But the Lennon story is not loud. It is paper. It is file language. It is a system that does not need to shout because it can simply watch and wait. The strange thing about surveillance is that it does not always begin with proof. It often begins with attention, with the feeling that someone is becoming a problem you might have to solve later. That is what the FBI material around Lennon suggests, especially once you place it in the timeline. By early 1972, deportation proceedings were moving forward, and in that same period, Lennon is described and discussed in government terms that sound like management, not justice. This is where the story stops being about a visa and becomes about a profile. A profile is not just facts. It is interpretation. It is the difference between a musician attending an event and a potential threat influencing a movement. And the easiest way to build a profile is through association. Who are you talking to? Who are you photographed with? Which causes do you touch? What does your presence do to a room? The Free John Sinclair rally is the perfect example of how a single moment can light up that kind of attention. On paper, it is a benefit concert connected to a sentencing controversy. In real life, it is a massive gathering where Lennon shows he can walk into political heat and multiply it. Sources describing the event make it clear the crowd was huge and the symbolism was strong. And what matters in a surveillance mindset is not whether the rally changed policy overnight. What matters is the demonstration of reach. It is a signal that this person can activate people. Now, imagine what a file does with that. It does not say, Lennon attended a concert. It says, Lennon attracted a crowd. Lennon is connected to anti-war circles. Lennon is appearing in spaces we already monitor. And suddenly, a guitar becomes a political lever, not because of the instrument, but because of the crowd behind it. You can see the logic hardening in the kinds of reporting that surfaced about the government approach. There were claims and documents and coverage that the goal was not just to monitor Lennon, but to neutralize him as a disruptive force. Even if you treat that language cautiously, it fits the pattern we already see in the immigration side. The strategy is not to debate him. The strategy is to reduce his ability to function. And that is why the Thurman memo matters so much. The phrase strategic countermeasure is cold, but it is also revealing. It implies Lennon is being treated as an opponent, not as a routine immigration case. It implies the system is thinking in terms of political impact. Once you accept that, everything else clicks into place. Surveillance is not separate from deportation. It supports it. It provides justification. It creates the atmosphere where an old conviction can be framed as the responsible reason. There's another piece of this that makes the story feel even more human. The file is not only about Lennon in public. It is about Lennon as a life. A person with a wife, a home, friends, schedules, stress. And immigration pressure turns that private life into vulnerability. You do not have to fabricate a scandal to destabilize someone. You could just keep them uncertain, keep them proving themselves, keep them waiting. That is why the fight becomes so psychologically exhausting. Lennon is not just defending a legal argument. He is defending his right to exist in the place where the world's biggest stage is located. And while he is doing that, he has to live with the idea that he is being read and interpreted by people whose job is not to understand him, but to manage risk. This is also where the evidence side of the story becomes more than gossip. Because the legal record shows the system was trying to fit Lennon into narrow statutory boxes, like whether his 1968 conviction for possession of cannabis resin made him excludable under the immigration law being applied. That might sound dry, but it is the whole point. The more technical the language becomes, the easier it is to hide intention inside procedure. If you argue only about definitions, nobody has to admit motive. And yet, motives have a way of leaking. Years later, reporting and retrospective accounts of the case, including discussions of the defense strategy, describe how Freedom of Information Act efforts helped reveal the political context behind the deportation push. The key idea is not that Lennon was innocent of every mistake a human can make. The key idea is that the machinery was being pointed at him for reasons that had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with influence. So what does the file really do? It transforms a person into a potential event. Lennon is not treated as a man who says things. He is treated as a man who can make other people do things. And in politics, that is the difference between noise and power. By the end of this section, you should feel the tension shifting. Because once someone is turned into a profile, the next step is not just monitoring. The next step is escalation. Not necessarily with violence, with pressure, with timing, with a moment designed to force a choice, to make them retreat, to make them stop showing up, to make them smaller. And that brings us to the turning point. The part where the effort stops looking like scattered attention and starts looking like an organized push. The moment when the government does not just watch Lennon from a distance, but makes a move that could have taken him off the map entirely. In the next section, we follow that move. The point where the battle becomes real, public, and irreversible. The moment Lennon realizes the system is not just observing his influence. It is trying to shut the door on it. At some point in a story like this, the pressure stops feeling theoretical. It stops being a rumor or a fear or a vague sense that someone important is watching you. It becomes a date on paper, a decision that says, in plain language, that your life in this country can be ended. For Lennon, that moment arrives when the immigration case turns into an actual deportation order. In March 1973, an immigration judge denied his effort to stay and ordered him deported. If you only read that sentence, it sounds simple, almost procedural. But imagine what it does to a person. One day you are building a life in New York. The next you are being told the state considers you removable. Not because you did something violent in America. Not because you were convicted here. But because an old conviction from another country has been pulled forward like a knife. And here is where the machinery shows its real shape. Deportation is not just a final act. It is a tool of timing. The process creates a kind of psychological prison without bars. You can still walk around the city, but your future is under someone else's control. Every plan becomes conditional. Every project becomes fragile. Your life is no longer something you simply live. It is something you defend. Then comes the next jolt. In 1974, the Board of Immigration Appeals took a step that made the threat feel immediate. Reports at the time described Lennon being given a deadline to leave the United States or face deportation. That is what escalation looks like in this world. Not a siren, a deadline, a polite sentence with violent consequences. This is also the point where the story becomes bigger than Lennon. Because once the case reaches this intensity, it stops being just a personal ordeal. It becomes a symbol. And symbols attract allies. The fight turns public in a deeper way. Lennon and Yoko are no longer just arguing with lawyers. They are collecting support, building a wall of legitimacy around him. Not to prove he is a saint, but to prove the country looks absurd if it throws him out over something so thin. And that public support matters because it changes the costs. Quietly removing someone is easy when nobody is watching. It is much harder when the removal starts to look political. Much harder when journalists, artists, and cultural figures treat the case like a test of principle. The more noise the case creates, the more the government has to pretend the case is purely legal. And the more it insists it is purely legal, the more suspicious the situation begins to feel. This is the turning point where Lennon likely realizes something that is difficult to admit out loud. The system does not need to win a moral argument to defeat you. It only needs to keep the process alive long enough to drain your momentum. And the longer it drags on, the more it disrupts your ability to do what made you powerful in the first place. Showing up, speaking, organizing, being present. But Lennon does not vanish. He does not quietly leave. He keeps living in the country while the case hangs over him like a storm cloud. That choice is itself a kind of defiance. And it also forces the conflict into a sharper question. If the government is truly just enforcing a neutral rule, then why does this case feel so strategic? Why does it feel like someone is trying to solve a political problem without ever saying the words politics? Because when you zoom out, the logic becomes almost too clean. A famous man enters the country. He starts aligning himself with anti-war activism. He has a built-in audience of millions, many of them young and already distrustful of leadership. The country is heading into a high-stakes political season, and suddenly the state discovers an old conviction that can be used to make him removable. The official story is legality. The emotional reality is control. This is where the case becomes dangerous in a new way. Not because Lennon is about to be arrested, but because it reveals a playbook. It shows how influence can be managed through technicalities. How a government can avoid looking like it is punishing speech while still shrinking the space where speech can operate. If it works on someone as famous as John Lennon, you have to wonder how often it works on people whose names nobody knows. And that is the cliff edge at the end of this section. The deportation order is not just pressure. It is a signal that someone wanted this pushed as far as it could go. Which means the real story is no longer simply whether Lennon stays or leaves. The real story becomes why it was worth the effort. In the next section, we step into the motive layer, the part that turns this from a legal drama into a power story. The evidence that suggests the fear was never just about a drug conviction or even about a musician being annoying. It was about what happens when a celebrity becomes a political force, and the people at the top decide that force has to be reduced before it spreads. If you strip away all the paperwork, all the hearings, all the polite language of immigration law, the Lennon case becomes something simpler and darker. It becomes a story about fear. Not fear of violence, not fear of crime, but fear of momentum. Because in the early 1970s, the United States was not just managing a war, it was managing public belief. And Lennon had the kind of credibility that could puncture belief without needing a single official platform. This is the part most people misunderstand. Governments do not panic when someone is merely loud. They panic when someone can synchronize other people. Lennon was not just a singer with opinions. He was a symbol with reach. He could step into a cause and instantly make it feel legitimate to millions of young people who already distrusted authority. And that is why the fear was never really about lyrics. It was about the effect he could have on turnout, on protest energy, on the emotional temperature of a generation. Once you see it that way, the immigration strategy makes perfect sense. Deportation is clean. It does not require a trial about speech. It does not require proving a conspiracy. It requires only one thing, a legal handle. And Lennon had one. A British drug conviction from 1968, small enough to look reasonable as a justification, but serious enough in immigration terms to be used as a lever. It is the perfect tool for a system that wants the outcome without wanting the headline. And then you find the language that makes the mask slip. A memo from Senator Strom Thurmond to the Attorney General framed the idea of terminating Lennon's visa as a strategic countermeasure. That phrasing matters because it shows intent. It is not the tone of a neutral bureaucratic decision. It is the tone of political chess. Lennon is not being described like a tourist with paperwork problems. He is being described like a threat to manage. This is where the story becomes psychologically disturbing because it reveals how power thinks. Power does not need to prove your message is wrong. It only needs to disrupt your ability to deliver it consistently. It can do that by keeping you exhausted, uncertain, and stuck in legal limbo. It can do that by forcing you to spend your energy on survival instead of influence. In other words, even if Lennon stayed physically in New York, the process was designed to shrink his bandwidth. But Lennon's side found something equally powerful: visibility. The more public the case became, the harder it was to pretend it was just routine. Support letters from prominent cultural figures began to pile up. The case started to look absurd to regular people who did not care about immigration technicalities but understood selective pressure when they saw it. And once the public starts suspecting that a law is being applied differently because of politics, the case becomes a liability for the system trying to enforce it. This is also where another idea enters the story, and it changes everything. Prosecutorial discretion. The notion that immigration authorities make choices about which cases to pursue aggressively and which cases to treat with flexibility. In most people's minds, law is law, a switch that turns on automatically. But in real life, enforcement is a decision. And when enforcement is a decision, politics can hide inside that decision without ever saying its name. That is why the Freedom of Information Act angle becomes so important later. Because FOIA does not just give you facts. It gives you context. It gives you the behind-the-scenes reasoning, the communications, the temperature of how officials were talking about Lennon. And when that context leaks into daylight, the story is no longer Lennon has a conviction. The story becomes Lennon has influence, and someone wanted to neutralize that influence at a very specific moment in American politics. Then history starts doing what it always does. It shifts the ground under everyone's feet. Nixon wins re-election in 1972. Watergate begins to unravel the administration's moral authority. Officials who felt untouchable begin to look exposed. And when power is on the defensive, it becomes harder to keep pushing a case that now looks like retaliation. The political season ends, the national mood changes, and suddenly the same machinery that felt unstoppable starts to lose momentum. But the most important thing is this. By the time the country's attention moves on, Lennon's case has already become more than a celebrity drama. It has become a test of whether the government can use immigration as a backdoor to punish political speech. A test of whether a famous person can force the system into the light. And that brings us to the moment where the legal story and the motive story collide. Because eventually, a court has to look at the pattern and decide whether this was truly law enforcement or something else entirely. In the next section, we follow the week that changes everything. The moment a judge reverses the deportation order and the language used to justify it exposes what was hiding underneath all along. And once you hear that reasoning, you will understand the real danger they did not want on stage. There's a particular kind of relief that does not feel like celebration. It feels like stepping out of a room where the air has been slowly thinning for years. That is what the end of this story feels like, because Lennon does not win by proving he is harmless. He wins because the machinery pushing him starts to look exposed. By 1975, the deportation battle had dragged on long enough to become a symbol, and the system was no longer operating in the clean, confident atmosphere it had at the start. The country had changed. The administration that once felt powerful had been humiliated by scandal. The public was more sensitive to the smell of political retaliation. And that is exactly when the legal world finally had to confront the question that had been sitting underneath everything. On October 7th, 1975, a federal judge in New York reversed the deportation order. That date matters because it is the moment the story stops being Lennon might be removed and becomes Lennon has forced the system to blink. The reversal did not just save a famous man's life in America. It signaled that the case was not being handled like a normal case. It suggested that political motives had been part of the push all along. And once that happens, everything flips. The same paperwork that was used as a weapon now becomes evidence of overreach. The same technicalities that were supposed to look neutral now look selective. And the most important psychological shift is this. Lennon is no longer simply defending himself. The system is now defending its own credibility. Not long after, Lennon's immigration status stabilizes for real. In 1976, he receives permanent residency, the green card, and the countdown finally ends. No more living inside a conditional future. No more hearing dates hanging over family decisions. For the first time since he arrived, he can exist without the feeling that a signature could erase his life in New York. But the ending is not tidy, because the real legacy is not only that Lennon stayed. The real legacy is what the case revealed about how power can move when it wants to reduce influence without admitting it is afraid. This story shows that the most effective form of suppression is often the one that looks boring, the one that looks like procedure, the one that sounds like it has nothing to do with speech. It also shows something else, something almost philosophical. Fame does not protect you from systems. Sometimes fame makes you a clearer target, because when you are famous, your influence is measurable. It is not a theory. It is an observable effect. And once influence becomes observable, it becomes manageable, at least in the minds of people who think they can control the social temperature of a country. So when people say Lennon was just a musician, this story answers quietly. No, he was a musician in a moment where music was not just entertainment. It was a carrier of belief. And belief is always political when enough people share it. And that brings us to the reveal you came here for. The fear was never really about a song. It was about what a song could do when the right person sang it, in the right city, at the right time, to the right generation. The danger they did not want on stage was not volume. It was influence. If you have been enjoying this kind of storytelling, the kind where a public legend hides a private file, make sure you stay close. Subscribe if you want more of these investigations, because we have an entire playlist of stars and their scandals, secrets, and hidden power battles waiting for you when you're ready to keep going. And one last thought before we close the file. The Lennon case did not end the practice of using technical pressure to control culture. If anything, it taught a lesson. It showed how quietly a system can try to move a person off the stage, and how rare it is for that person to have enough light around them to fight back. Because the question is not only what they tried to do to Lennon. The question is who else never had the spotlight to stop it. And that is where our next story begins. Because once the system learns it can't silence you through music, it finds another language. Fear, rumors, moral panique. The kind that turns a band into a national threat overnight. And if you think Lennon was treated like a problem, wait until you see what happened when the country decided the Rolling Stones weren't just loud, they were dangerous.